I wasn't just walking out of a job. I was walking out with his entire house of cards balanced on my shoulders. My name is Nate Ellison. I'm 48 years old. I live in Denver, Colorado, and until 2 hours ago, I was senior systems architect at Apex StratLog, a logistics software company that made a fortune off optimization systems I built over 14 years. 14 years of designs, iterations, breakthroughs, all of it mine. And yet, here I was, standing in my boss's office while he laughed in my face. "Good luck finding a job at your age, bud," Darren Leeds said, smirking as he sipped his coffee from a gold-rimmed mug that probably cost more than my entire week's groceries. Tech don't hire guys pushing 50 unless they're CEOs. I didn't say anything, not right away. I just watched him like I was watching a coyote bark at a thundercloud, loud, cocky, but clueless about the storm rolling in. I had a cardboard box in my hands. My drives, external backups, notebooks, all my logs and build environments were inside. Darren leaned back in his chair like he'd just told a great joke. His suit was some tailored Navy thing that probably had a name, like the Lexington or some crap. He always wore those. Thought they made him look powerful. "Let me guess," he said, smirking. "You finally realized you peaked here, huh? Thought you'd leave before the floor drops out? Not the worst move, honestly. But you should have talked to me first. We might have found you a comfortable landing spot. Something advisory, maybe." That's what he always did, talked in loops of nothing. Advisory meant being shelved until you quit. Darren was all about optics, flashy titles, big words, zero depth. Called me his operations guy in front of clients, like I was some IT technician he kept around to fix printers. "You want to know what's in the box?" I asked. He blinked at that, like it hadn't occurred to him to care. "Excuse me?" "In the box," I repeated. "Logs, dots, backups, test environments, code snapshots, iteration sets, essentially my work." His smile faltered a little. "Uh-huh. And you think you can just walk out with that?" I nodded. "I know I can. See, 5 years ago during the audit, we revised the company's IP policy. You remember that?" He said nothing, just stared. "You had me write it, legal reviewed it, you signed off without reading a word. I made sure version control data created off hours and off site wasn't classified as company IP unless explicitly flagged." His mouth opened, then closed again. Color drained from his face like water from a cracked pipe. For a guy who always made a show of being in control, he suddenly looked very much like a man sitting in the wrong chair. I don't think that holds legally." "It does. I checked. Twice. With outside counsel." I wasn't mad. Not anymore. I was beyond that. This wasn't a tantrum or a power play. It was precision. Everything he thought he controlled had already been re-weighted, re-indexed, and recalibrated. And he didn't even know it yet. "You can't just walk out with all that," he said again. But this time, it was quieter. Not angry, not bold, just desperate. I set the box on the floor and rested my hands on the top. "You've been calling me your operations guy for years," I said. "Told clients you came up with the Axion neural stack. Told investors you were the one who optimized the express loop. I built those systems in my garage because you wouldn't fund them, every single one, while you were off playing golf with the board." He shifted in his seat like it was getting too hot. That chair, big, leather, absurd, had always been his throne. I used to joke it probably cost more than my first car. Not anymore. Now I was looking at it for what it was. Temporary. "You're gonna regret this," he said quietly. "I don't think I will." I bent down, picked the box back up, and turned toward the door. Just as I reached the threshold, he found one last ounce of bravado. "Where are you even going, huh? You don't have anything lined up. And even if you did, they're not gonna pay Apex's guy more than I did." I paused, turned just enough so he could see my face. "I'm not Apex's guy anymore." He tilted his head, confused. "I'm Ardent's," I said. "As of last week." The silence hit like a slap. "You... what?" I smiled. Not big, just enough to let him know the lights were finally on and he wasn't the one flipping the switch. "I signed on as CTO," I said. "They called last spring, you intercepted their email, said it was below my level, so I reached out myself." He stood. "Too late. You can't..." but I was already out the door. As I stepped into the elevator and hit the button for the lobby, I could still hear him shouting through the glass wall of his office, red-faced, stammering. No idea how much worse it was going to get. He thought I was just a background tech, the guy who made things run. He never once imagined I might also be the guy who could tear it all down, and that's what made this so satisfying. Not the job, not the title. The fact that I hadn't even started yet, and I'd already outplayed him. The funny thing is, it didn't even start with a plan. It started with a drink. It was the Apex Holiday Mixer, December 2 years ago. Some rented out rooftop downtown, overpriced hors d'oeuvres, and a jazz quartet that looked like they'd been pulled off Craigslist 2 hours before the event. I was standing near the back with a lukewarm Coke in hand, watching Darren do what he did best, holding court. He was schmoozing Apex's board chairman, Art Kellerman, one of those old money guys with a firm handshake and a weak understanding of what we actually did. I wasn't trying to listen, but Darren's voice carried like a foghorn. He leaned in, grinning like he was about to deliver a killer punchline. "Axion neural stack," he said, swirling his drink. "Yeah, that was me, my vision, my blueprint. Just had my ops guy build the bones." I blinked. That was it. That was the moment, because the Axion neural stack had been my life for 6 months. I built it in my garage, long before Apex decided to greenlight the project. I ran power cables through my laundry room to keep my test rigs running overnight. I spent weekends fine-tuning loop handlers, trimming weight from the learning model so it could run hot under simulated delivery stress. Darren had never seen a line of that code, and yet here he was, claiming the patent as his brainchild, reducing my contribution to the bones. That night, something in me snapped, not emotionally, but strategically. I stopped thinking like a builder and started thinking like a saboteur. Back at home, I opened a new encrypted folder and started compiling emails, timestamp threads showing early concept drafts, diagrams, and feedback loops with engineers long before the project even had a name. Git commits, each with my handle, my terminal ID, and metadata proving my ownership. Slack messages, private channels where Darren's only input was, "Looks cool, can we make it sexier?" Meeting notes, summaries I'd kept, because I'm the kind of guy who documents everything. Piece by piece, I built a ledger, not just of code, but of the story behind it. A quiet, methodical dismantling of Darren's fiction. Then I did something I probably should have done years earlier. I reached out to Martin Webb. Martin was VP of R&D at Ardent Systems, Apex's biggest competitor and Darren's personal boogeyman. He'd been trying to poach whoever was really behind Apex's edge for years. Problem was, every time a recruiter email came in from Ardent, it somehow never reached me. I only found out about that little detail when an engineer in HR quietly told me Darren had a gatekeeping filter set up to screen all external inquiries to senior staff. So, I bypassed the inbox entirely. I emailed Martin directly from a Proton Mail address. We met for coffee that Friday. Martin was sharp, ex-technical himself, before going corporate. When I showed him the documents, his expression changed. "You're telling me this entire stack, Axion, the preload model, the cascade balancing, all of that was you?" "All of it," I said, start to finish. He didn't blink. "You want a job?" "Not just a job," I replied. "I want a seat at the table, and I want these patents under the right name." That got his attention. A week later, I was on a Zoom call with Ardent's legal counsel, walking them through everything. Code chains, draft archives, even internal project logs where I was listed as Resource Nate E, while Darren was primary inventor. Not anymore. We filed new claims. Quietly. The legal team said it would take time, but the foundation was solid. Meanwhile, I stayed put at Apex, acting like nothing had changed. I kept coding, kept smiling, kept handing Darren just enough to keep him comfortable, but never enough to see what was really coming. Every system I touched after that, I documented twice. Once for Apex, once for me. And in every commit, every notebook, I layered traceable markers, encryption fingerprints, unique build tags, timestamp offsets. So, when the storm finally hit, there'd be no mistaking who wrote what. And here's the kicker. The one thing Darren never anticipated. I wasn't just building code anymore. I was building a story, a narrative, a case, one that would be impossible to untangle once the lights came on. And those lights, they were coming sooner than Darren thought. 3 weeks from that day, Apex was headlining a global tech summit. Darren had bragged to everyone that he'd be giving a keynote on next-gen optimization frameworks. The deck was already in motion. The invite list was public. The live stream was locked in. Only this time, I wouldn't be writing his script. He'd be stepping on that stage alone, surrounded by people who thought he was a genius. And when they started asking questions, well, they'd find out who the real architect was. I didn't expect him to panic. Not really. When I walked back into Darren's office that morning, same corner view, same stupid leather chair, same mug that read, "Leadership, it's not just a title." I thought he'd smirk, maybe lean back and do that thing he did where he steepled his fingers like some bargain bin Bond villain. I thought he'd play it cool. He didn't. "I've accepted a new position," I said, sliding a white envelope across his desk. "Effective immediately, with Ardent Systems." For a second, I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Confusion maybe, then disbelief, and then pure, unfiltered dread. "Ardent?" he echoed, like he'd just heard a dirty word. "As in, ardent?" I nodded. He opened the envelope with shaking hands. Just a basic resignation letter. No insults, no digs. But it hit him harder than anything I could have written. "No notice?" he muttered, scanning the paper. "No transition plan?" "I don't owe you a transition," I said calmly. "You told the board last month that everything I build is plug and play. Figure it out." He pushed away from his desk and started rifling through a filing cabinet behind him. The desperation was setting in fast now, his breathing getting shallow, his words tripping over each other. "There's gotta be something. Hang on. Where's that HR policy binder?" I watched him thumb through it like he was looking for a life raft. "You can't just go work for a direct competitor," he snapped, finally landing on a page and slapping it down. "There's a non-compete." "Nope," I said. "There's not." "Bullshit," he hissed. "You said I wasn't executive level enough to justify one," I reminded him. "That was your phrasing, remember? When legal asked if you wanted me on the exec contract track, you said I was essential talent, but not C-suite." He blinked, opened his mouth, closed it again. "And besides," I added, "if there had been a non-compete, it wouldn't be enforceable under Colorado law the way you wrote it." Another thing I mentioned 3 years ago during the revision process, which, again, you didn't read. He slumped into his chair like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. For the first time since I'd known him, Darren looked like a man who realized the ground beneath him wasn't as solid as he thought. "You're making a mistake," he said finally. His voice wasn't smug anymore, just tired and maybe a little scared. "We built something here, Nate. This company believed in you." I stared at him for a long moment. "No," I said quietly. "This company believed in you. You believed in me doing the work for you." He didn't respond, just sat there, surrounded by plaques with his name on them, awards he didn't earn, framed articles quoting him as the visionary behind systems he barely understood. I stood up and picked up my box, same one from the day before, drives, notebooks, physical logs. I didn't need them anymore, but I wanted him to see them again. Just a little reminder that I wasn't leaving empty-handed. As I turned to leave, he reached for one last card. "I gave you a platform, Nate," he called after me. "You think Ardent's gonna worship you? You think you're gonna be some rock star just because you built a few systems?" I paused at the doorway, turned around. "I don't need worship," I said. "I just need the truth on record." I pushed open the glass door. As I stepped into the hallway, he called out again. Quieter this time. "You'll regret this." I didn't answer. I just walked past the bullpen, past the same half-curious glances from analysts who never quite understood what I actually did, past the HR lounge with its empty snack rack and passive-aggressive clean-up-after-yourself sign. Elevator opened. I stepped inside. Hit lobby. As the doors started to close, I saw Darren rush to the window near reception, phone in hand, already dialing someone, probably legal or PR, or maybe one of the board members he'd sweet-talked into, believing he was some kind of genius. Didn't matter, that fuse had already been lit. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone buzzed. Text from Ardent's counsel. "Patent review complete. You're the primary inventor on Axion and 3 supporting modules. Let's talk next week. I read it twice, then smiled. Not the polite corporate kind I'd been trained to wear. Not the forced corner-of-the-mouth version I used at investor meetings. A real smile, the kind you feel in your spine. Because the truth was, the real revenge wasn't quitting. It wasn't getting a better job, or the title, or the pay bump. It was this: letting the silence speak for itself. Letting Darren walk into that summit in 3 weeks, without me behind the curtain, without the slide deck I usually wrote, without the crutch he never realized he leaned on. And when they asked him the first hard question, that silence would roar louder than anything I could have ever said. And best of all, I'd left breadcrumbs, version logs, commit trails, back-end doc timestamps, a digital trail leading straight to his lies. By the time they traced it, I'd be 2 steps ahead, because Darren always thought I worked under him. He never understood. I was always working around him. 2 weeks into my new role at Ardent Systems, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove I belonged in the room. There were no buzzwords flying around, no value synergy pitches or paradigm shift posters taped to the walls. Just engineers, focused, sharp, curious engineers who actually listened when you talked about data structure. Martin Webb walked me through the office on my first Monday. A floor of glass walls, scribbled whiteboards, and half-drunk energy drinks. He introduced me to the core team: Felix, systems architecture; Priya, predictive modeling; and Sam, API design. No handshakes pretending to mean something. Just nods, respectful, professional, like they already knew what I was about. That afternoon, I pulled up a draft I'd been working on the side for months: an architectural overhaul. A new kind of optimization layer that used constraint partitions and predictive sequencing to minimize recompute time across dynamic routing environments. Felix leaned over the table, hands on his knees, reading the schematic on the screen. After a few minutes of silence, he looked up. "This makes everything else look 5 years behind," he said flatly. Then he smiled. That was the moment I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. Over the next 10 days, I walked them through everything. The logic behind my data loop design, the buffering protocol that reduced overflow lag, even the error injection testing I used to push Apex systems to the edge, and they got it. No blank stares, no fake nodding, just ideas bouncing off the walls like sparks. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on Darren from a distance. His social media feed, once filled with smug LinkedIn essays about thought leadership and vision alignment, had started to shift. The long-winded posts were gone, replaced by reposts of generic tech quotes and vague affirmations. One post just said, "Teams win, egos lose. Leadership lessons." I had to laugh. But the real fun started in the comments. Engineers, real ones, started poking holes in his PR fog. People asked, "What framework powers your new delivery model?" And, "Are you still using recursive segmenting, or did you pivot to modular aggregation?" Darren didn't answer. Or when he did, it was word salad. We let the data speak for itself. Translation: I have no idea what any of this means, and I'm hoping you'll stop asking. He was unraveling, slowly, publicly, and people were noticing. Even on internal message boards and Git threads, I saw signs of the shift. One Apex dev posted, "Anyone else wondering what's happening with the stack updates? Haven't seen a real push in weeks." Someone else replied, "It's almost like the guy who actually built the system isn't around anymore." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. At Ardent, the real work was just beginning. We were iterating fast. Daily builds, test scrapes, performance benchmarks that outpaced anything I'd seen at Apex in years. The difference? Every voice in the room mattered. Nobody had to yell over someone in a $4,000 suit who barely understood what a hash map was. Felix asked if I wanted to present the new engine at an upcoming R&D roundtable. I told him I'd rather wait. Let the product speak first. He nodded. No pressure, just quiet excitement. But behind the scenes, our legal team was moving fast. Darren didn't know it yet, but the patent paperwork had already been amended and sent back to the Office of Record. I was listed as primary inventor on 4 core systems, including Axion. All the proof was there. Dates, .repos, documentation, Slack messages, digital fingerprints on every major build. And that trail, that was no accident. I had started laying that groundwork the moment I heard Darren say my blueprint at that holiday party. Every revision I made after that came with a timestamp, a shadow backup, a tag string only I knew how to trace. I didn't just want to leave Apex. I wanted to make sure that when the truth came out, there'd be no room left to spin it. And now, the truth was leaking. The conference Darren couldn't cancel, the Global Tech Summit, was right around the corner. It was still listed on the program. Next-Gen Logistics Optimization, Radical Frameworks for Tomorrow's Challenges. Speaker, Darren Leeds, CTO, Apex Strat Log. Only, he wasn't going to have the answers this time. I was already on the attendee list, front row. Let the data speak for itself? Sure. Let's see how he handles the silence when the questions come. The expo wasn't big. Not compared to what was coming. Just a regional logistics tech event in Austin. Mid-tier crowd, industry folks, professors, vendors with folding tables and branded flash drives. But Darren couldn't cancel it. Apex had already paid for the keynote slot, and he needed to keep up appearances. I watched it from my office at Ardent. We streamed it on the big screen in the war room. The team gathered around like it was game day. Darren stepped up to the podium in one of his signature suits, charcoal gray with a patterned pocket square, like he was dressing to distract. He looked tired. Not just the usual jet lag and late-night schmoozing kind. This was the kind of tired you get when the walls start closing in, and you can't remember which lie you told last. His talk was titled, Operational Evolution Through Dynamic Modular Frameworks. Total gibberish. There were slides, stock diagrams, vague arrows pointing to floating boxes labeled things like data synergy and adaptive inputs. 15 minutes in, a professor from UT Austin raised a hand during the Q&A. Can you elaborate on how your system handles dynamic input, weighting, and real-time optimization scenarios? He asked. Specifically when resource pools are throttled mid-cycle? Darren blinked, paused for 5 full seconds. Then he said, We believe in intuitive layering of operational data. A couple panelists exchanged glances. One of them, a logistics CTO from Atlanta, tilted his head and asked, What does that mean exactly? Darren smiled, like that might buy him time. But he had nothing. You could tell. He was trying to read the room, to figure out what answer would get a nod without giving anything concrete. We ensure that system flexibility remains responsive to changing conditions, he said finally. What kind of flexibility? The professor asked. Are we talking about constraints being rebalanced post-propagation, or are you reinitiating the load optimizer with new weights mid-cycle? Darren shifted at the podium, adjusted his mic. Well, the framework is modular, so we allow for strategic response buffering. A beat of silence. Then someone on the panel said it, flat, unimpressed. So, you restart the loop? That was it. The house of cards trembled, because restarting the loop is what you do when you don't have a system. It's a brute force workaround, not a solution. No one building a modern optimizer would lean on that unless they had no idea what else to do. The moderator moved to another question, but the shift had already happened. You could feel it. Darren's confidence cracked, his shoulders stiff, his voice trying to sound casual but landing somewhere between robotic and defensive. Another question came in, this one from a startup founder in Chicago. What principles are you using to manage runtime variance and constraint mapping? Darren cleared his throat. Runtime is managed using a hybrid model that adjusts based on priority layers. Which layers? She asked. All of them, he said. And the room started to murmur. Back at Ardent, Felix leaned over and muttered, He's crashing. I nodded. Live. The next day the blog post dropped. Has Apex Stratlog lost its edge? It wasn't from one of the big outlets, just a respected logistics blog with a decent following. But it spread fast. The author outlined how vague Darren's answers were, how his terminology kept shifting, how he offered zero technical detail during the entire session. Then came the thread on StackNet, a community site for engineers and system builders. Someone posted a side-by-side comparison of Darren's past talks with real patent filings. Comment after comment piled in. None of this tracks with Apex's actual code output. Everything notable was authored by a Nathan E. on the commit logs. Who was that? Wait, isn't that guy gone? People were connecting dots. The very trail I'd left behind, the logs, the timestamps, the Slack archives, was surfacing, quietly, organically. One user posted, "It's like whoever actually built their stack isn't there anymore." Still, I said nothing. I didn't need to say a word. Inside Ardent, our team knew what was coming next. Darren was outmatched, outclassed, and most importantly, alone. He was standing on a foundation he didn't pour, in a house he didn't build, trying to explain blueprints he never read. And that conference coming up, the global one, the real deal, he couldn't back out, couldn't send someone else, couldn't fake his way through another talk with buzzwords and recycled slides, because this time, the crowd would be real. Engineers, developers, professors, people who didn't clap just because someone had a fancy title. And I'd be there, front row, no script, no backup. Just Darren, a stage, and the questions he couldn't dodge anymore. Let the unraveling begin. The ballroom at the International Conference on Computational Systems was massive, 2 floors below ground level, in a Vegas hotel that smelled like polished marble and corporate ambition. Over 2,500 engineers, data scientists, and CTOs from 500 companies had gathered. Tech royalty in slacks and Allbirds. And Darren was about to walk into the lion's den. His talk was listed as Next-Gen Logistics Optimization, Radical Frameworks for Tomorrow's Challenges. Flashy title. Totally empty. I'd have known, because I used to write those. I sat in the front row, badge around my neck, coffee in hand. To my left was Felix from Ardent. To my right was Lisa Ramon, our VP of Engineering. Neither said much, they didn't have to. The stage lights dimmed, the screen behind the podium flickered to life. Darren stepped out to polite applause. He looked wrong, sweaty, pale, eyes darting between cameras and the audience like a man scanning for exits. "Thank you all for joining me," he said, gripping the podium like it might bolt away. "I'm thrilled to share how Apex Stratlog is reshaping the logistics landscape through bold, modular innovation." His first slide popped up. It was garbage, a flowchart with meaningless arrows connecting buzzwords. No math, no logic trees, just words like throughput velocity and synergistic parcel streams slapped into rounded boxes. I felt secondhand embarrassment and secondhand satisfaction all at once. He babbled through his first 10 minutes. You could hear the chairs squeaking as people shifted uncomfortably. A few took notes. Most just watched, trying to figure out if this was performance art or a technical talk gone sideways. Then came the Q&A. First hand up. A guy from NVIDIA. Serious voice, serious brain. "Can you walk us through how your system manages constraint graph behavior under resource-limited conditions?" Darren blinked. "We utilize a modular strategy to address those scenarios." Dead silence. The guy furrowed his brow. "Modular? How? Are you using heuristic pruning, or do you segment based on node criticality?" Darren's eyes twitched. "We combine both approaches. We adapt in real time." Then the next question. A woman from MIT. "In your latest white paper, there's no mention of dynamic buffering. Are you assuming zero latency conditions, or are you smoothing packet delay?" Darren opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "We take a flexible approach. We respond to latency organically. We don't force structure onto the system." A few people in the audience glanced at each other. Someone in the third row muttered, "What the hell does that even mean?" Lisa leaned toward me. "He's toast." Another hand. "What's your equation for reweighting prediction paths when endpoint priority shifts mid-loop?" Darren stammered. "We don't rely on static weights. We let the network guide its own optimization." "You're describing a black box," the guy said flatly. Darren's neck flushed red. "We believe in intuitive design," he offered weakly. That was it. The point of no return. Question after question came in. Some from students, some from researchers. And Darren's answers got worse and worse. A broken record of vague phrases and empty jargon. He started sweating visibly. One sleeve of his suit had bunched at the shoulder. His voice cracked once. And then, the twist. Someone stood up in the fourth row. Lisa. She took the mic from the aisle usher. The whole auditorium turned. "I think I can clarify," she said. Calm, composed, deadly. Darren froze, like he was seeing a ghost. He recognized her. Of course he did. They'd met at investor mixers, though he never remembered her name. She turned slightly and gestured toward the front row. I'd like to introduce you all to someone. This is Nathan Ellison, Chief Technology Officer at Ardent Systems, and, until recently, the architect behind Apex StratLog's optimization framework. Gasps audible. People craned their necks. The cameras shifted focus. A wave of whispers rippled through the room. I stood up, walked toward the stage. Darren didn't move. I took the mic from Lisa and turned to the crowd. "Good afternoon," I said. "Let's talk constraint splitting, latency buffering, and polynomial reductions using adaptive cycles." The next 15 minutes weren't about revenge. They were about truth, clean, hard, undeniable truth. I pulled up slides from my laptop, real slides, architecture flows, regression metrics, live simulation graphs. The stuff engineers dream of. I broke down our new runtime segmentation layer, showed failure maps from Apex's legacy build and how we'd resolved them, quoted equations, explained why priority inversion was killing performance in Apex's routing algorithm. Every question, I answered. Specifics, real terms, no fluff. And when I finished, the crowd stood, all of them. Applause loud enough to drown out the voice in my head that had doubted this would ever happen. Then Lisa took the mic again. "One final question," she said, turning back to Darren. "Would you care to explain why someone else was presenting your work for the last 14 years? He didn't answer. He couldn't. And in that silence, everything shifted. Because the collapse wasn't loud, it was surgical. I stood behind the podium, mic clipped to my collar, the hum of the room settling into total stillness. The moment Lisa introduced me, Nathan Ellison, CTO at Ardent Systems, the entire ballroom had shifted. Eyes darted from her to me, then back to Darren, who looked like someone had pulled the rug, the stage, and the air out from under him all at once. He hadn't moved, still frozen beside the big Apex banner, like a man waiting for someone to shout, "Cut," and call it all a prank. But this wasn't a prank. This was the reckoning. "Good afternoon," I said, my voice calm but clear. "Let's talk about what logistics optimization actually looks like, under pressure, at scale, and in the real world." I brought up my own slide deck, clean, sharp, fully loaded with its architecture maps, load distribution graphs, and real-world performance stats. My system, my framework. What I'd been building since before Darren even knew what the term constraint splitting meant. First slide, constraint architecture. I broke it down simply. How we isolate bottlenecks using a layered propagation model that reroutes in real time. Then I moved to latency buffering, our approach to reducing jitter in unstable bandwidth environments without sacrificing output speed. Every concept came with visuals, equations, annotated performance logs, regression curves. Nothing flashy, just substance. The kind you don't need to hype when it works. I could see people in the audience nodding, taking notes, snapping photos. One guy mouthed, "Holy shit," when I showed our polynomial reduction engine hitting sub-second recalibration in a live route test. Hands shot up during Q&A. The questions came fast and sharp, and I welcomed every one of them. What about high-frequency input variance across multi-zone coordination? Adaptive cycles. We reweight using real-time latency and stochastic feedback models. I can show the math if you want. Someone asked about edge node decisioning during peak delivery congestion. I gave him 3 layers of fallback logic with failover triggers. Every answer landed. Behind me, Darren still hadn't spoken. He hadn't walked off either. He just stood there, small under the lights, watching the room slip out of his control. Then came Lisa. She stepped back up to the mic. "I think we've seen enough to answer the original question," she said. "But I've got one more. Darren," she paused just long enough for the silence to stretch taut. "Would you care to explain why someone else has been presenting your work for the last 14 years? That was it. Not a yell, not an accusation. Just a question, simple and direct. Darren opened his mouth, but nothing came out. You could see the gears grinding behind his eyes, looking for a lifeline, something, anything, to say that would explain away everything the room had just seen, but there was nothing left to say. Because here's the truth. The silence of a man caught in a lie is louder than any microphone. I didn't gloat, didn't throw insults. I just looked at him. That was enough. The audience looked too. They saw him not as a leader or an innovator or even a fraud, but as a man who had nothing left to offer. And then came the flash. Journalists in the back of the room had been quiet until then, recording, scribbling notes, whispering to each other. But now phones were out. Cameras clicked, tweets were flying. Someone near the aisle leaned over and whispered, "This story's gonna blow up Monday morning." I nodded. They weren't wrong. By the time I stepped down from the stage, people were standing, not out of politeness, but real respect. Engineers, architects, CTOs, people who lived and breathed this world, were on their feet. Darren tried to slip out through the side curtain, but a couple of reporters spotted him and followed. I didn't watch. I didn't need to, because this wasn't just the collapse of a lie. This was the moment truth took the mic, and I wasn't going to let go of it again. Darren tried to spin it, of course. In the post-conference interview, one of those slick backroom setups with a sponsored mic flag and a nervous tech journalist, he leaned into the camera with that old fake confidence and called it a collaborative environment with fluid ownership. His exact words, "You know, when you build innovation at scale, credit becomes a shared currency. We all bring value." I watched the clip with the Ardent team in our lounge. Felix nearly choked on his iced coffee. Lisa just shook her head. "Credit becomes a shared currency," she said. Deadpan. He should put that on his tombstone. But the spin didn't work. Not this time. Within 24 hours, the first domino fell. One of Apex's biggest clients, a global freight company, announced they were suspending their contract pending internal review of development leadership credibility. I'd worked on that account for 2 years. They knew exactly who wrote the system they relied on, and now they knew where I was. By the end of the week, 2 more clients paused engagements. Apex's stock dropped 31% in 5 trading days. And for the first time since I could remember, Darren went quiet. No LinkedIn posts, no keynote announcements, no press releases, just silence. Then came the legal action. The IP firm Ardent retained, Real Killers, No Fluff, filed to revise 6 patent records. They listed me as the primary inventor on every system that had been marketed under Darren's name. Axion Neural Stack, Path Logic Core, Redline Runtime Framework. All of it. The documents included everything: commit logs, Slack transcripts, internal emails, Git timestamps, even Darren's own text messages that read, "Nate will take care of the build. I'll package it." The patent office accepted the complaint for review within 48 hours. That's when Apex went into PR lockdown. No updates on their homepage, no social media activity. Their careers page disappeared completely. 2 weeks later, I checked the executive bio section on their website. Darren's name was gone. No announcement. Just wiped, like he'd never existed. But the final hit didn't come from a lawyer or a journalist. It came in an envelope. It was a plain white letter, no return address, postmarked from Chicago, where I knew Darren lived. I opened it at my desk, half expecting it to be some cease and desist last gasp. It wasn't. It was handwritten. Careful, cursive, tight spacing. The kind of penmanship that felt like it took effort. I told myself for years that I deserved the credit because I could sell it, but you were the one who built it. I'm sorry. Darren. No salutation, no closing, just that. I read it twice, then set it down. I wasn't angry. Not anymore. He had finally told the truth, but the timing didn't change the outcome. You don't get absolution after the market crashes and the spotlight moves. You don't get to rewrite history when you're the reason it needed rewriting in the first place. At Ardent, things had shifted fast. After the conference, our demo requests tripled. Recruiters stopped sending feelers and started begging. Clients I hadn't talked to in years reached out directly, congratulating me and asking about Ardent's roadmap. We had meetings with Fedship, Translogix, even a European supply chain think tank that wanted to license our predictive engine for city routing models. But the part that hit me hardest, our junior engineers started copying me on their builds. Not for sign-off, but just because they wanted my eyes on it, like they saw me not as the operations guy or the backroom coder, but as someone who mattered out in front. Felix started calling it the Nate effect. Martin Webb pulled me aside one day after a team sync and said, "You know what your real revenge was? You made it undeniable." And he was right. I didn't burn Apex down. I just stepped out of the shadows and let the lights do their job. Now, Darren was gone. Apex was bleeding. And Ardent? We weren't just playing catch-up anymore. We were leading, and I wasn't in the background this time. I was the face of it. 6 months later, I stood on the same stage where Darren had unraveled. Only this time, the seats were full for a different reason. I wasn't here to cover for someone. I wasn't writing scripts behind the scenes or debugging someone else's demo last minute. I was the keynote, the closer. The name printed in bold at the top of the program: Nathan Ellison, CTO, Ardent Systems. Constraint harmony, designing the next leap in predictive logistics. I adjusted the mic, looked out over the crowd, some familiar faces from the last conference, some new, and felt that quiet, grounded thing in my chest again. Not nerves, not ego, just certainty. "We've spent years treating optimization like it's a fixed formula," I began. But real-world systems don't care about formulas. They care about volatility, about supply shocks, fuel costs, late drivers, snowstorms in Ohio. And if you want to beat the chaos, you don't predict the noise. You learn to adapt faster than it can spread. Slide 1 lit up behind me, a full breakdown of our hybrid engine, the one we'd been building at Ardent ever since the dust settled. Predictive layering fused with real-time adaptive rerouting. No buzzwords, just solid design, something Apex could never have imagined, let alone shipped. I walked them through the stats. 83% reduction in route planning time, 47% improvement in delivery precision under unstable conditions, more than double the recovery rate after input disruption compared to industry benchmarks. But the numbers weren't the story. The real story was who built it and how. "This system wasn't made by a lone genius in a garage," I said, smiling a little. "It was built by a team of engineers who respect each other, challenge each other, and," I pointed at the back row where Felix and Lisa were seated, "actually know how to listen." I paused there. Let that hang. Because that, more than anything, was the difference. At Apex, I was the quiet shadow. At Ardent, I was the architect and the voice. I got to see ideas become systems and systems become products. Not through politics or credit hoarding, but through collaboration, through real leadership, and the industry noticed. By the time I stepped off that stage, 2 Fortune 100 companies had already messaged Lisa asking for demos. Our booth was packed for the rest of the day. One VC, who'd ignored our calls 3 years ago, asked for a private meeting, said he'd misjudged the landscape. I almost laughed. Back in the green room, someone handed me a bottled water and said, "You just made Apex look like an old fax machine." I didn't argue. Later that night, after the applause faded and the cameras shut off, I sat at the hotel bar with Felix and Lisa. We didn't talk much at first, just sipped bourbon and let the weight of everything settle. "You realize," Felix said eventually, "you've gone from being the guy behind the curtain to the guy everyone's quoting tomorrow." I thought about that for a second. "No," I said. "I think I just finally stepped out of the wrong room." We toasted to that. And here's the thing no one tells you about revenge. It's not always fire and fury. Sometimes it's just doing the work. Proving, quietly but publicly, that you were never the problem, that the ones who ignored you, who stole from you, who told you to stay in your lane, they were just betting on the wrong future. Now I was building the right one. As the night wound down, my phone buzzed with a dozen new messages. Reporters, partners, 2 speaking invitations, even one from a university asking if I'd guest lecture. I ignored them for now. Instead, I opened the photo Lisa had taken earlier. Me at the podium, slides behind me, crowd locked in. 6 months ago, Darren had choked in front of that same crowd because he thought visibility was control. What he never understood was that visibility without substance is a trap, and I had all the substance. It took 14 years, 3 job titles, a pile of stolen credit, and 1 spectacular collapse. But I was finally here, not just in the room, at the front of it.